This week I'm joined by Michael P Federici, who is a professor of political science and international relations at Middle Tennessee State University. He is the author and editor of multiple books on political philosophy, and in this episode we discuss the work of Eric Voegelin, alongside discussions on Gnosticism, the meaning of the phrase Immanentize the Eschaton, liberalism, neoliberalism, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support Hermitix and get access to some exclusive content, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Michael P Federici, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Happy to be here.
We are going to be discussing the work of Eric Voegelin, primarily taking the discussion, the inspiration for the discussion from the book you wrote in 2002 for the series Library of Modern Thinkers, simply titled Eric Voegelin. But before we dive in with the work of Voegelin, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how this book came about.
Okay. I am the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Middle Tennessee State University, which is just about 30 miles south of Nashville, Tennessee. And I've been at MTSU for 4 years. This is my 5th year. Prior to that, I taught at Mercyhurst University in Erie, Pennsylvania for 24 years. I did my PhD at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., which is where I met David Walsh, who is the one who introduced me to Eric Voegelin's work. I had a couple of Voegelin seminars with David, and I will confess to you that Voegelin didn't take. The first time that I read and was introduced to him, and it was only after painstaking sort of work and determination to finally figure out what this guy is arguing, that I saw the power of his ideas. And then after I was in the profession for a decade or so, Jeff Nelson at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute asked me if I would be interested in writing a volume on Voegelin for their series on modern thinkers. And I agreed to do it. And it took me a few years to do it, but it was a wonderful, worthwhile project.
Okay. Perhaps we'll get into why it was Voegelin didn't initially stick later on. I'm sure. Perhaps I'll ask that now. Actually, is there, now you've spent a lot of time with his work, is there reasons that you can see why initially you didn't really warm to him and his work?
Well, it had to do with a couple of factors. One is Voegelin is a very dense philosopher. He has, in some instances, a language of his own. He does not really write for a broad audience. He writes for very specialized scholars. So it requires an investment in time to be able to penetrate to his central ideas. Once you do, and once the language becomes more familiar, then it's easier to follow what he's arguing. So I struggled as a young graduate student just trying to figure out what he was saying. And I think that's an obstacle for many people who pick up something of Voegelin's and try and read it, especially if they pick up a lot of his later work, which tends to be far more dense than some of his earlier work, or than his essays, which are often on fairly contemporary political issues and quite readable. But if you pick up some of his work that's on the theory of consciousness, the 5th volume of Order and History, for example, and just try to understand Voegelin by reading a book like that, for most people, it's just not going to happen. You have to start in the right place.
That's interesting. I mean, it's sort of always the final question is where you'd advise people to begin. So we'll sort of touch on that later. But at the beginning here, I do like to get the Hermitix question out. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? And as we're talking about Voegelin, well, he's already in the room.
Well, I will emphasize that while the question is, of course, ahistorical, I'd love to be in that room just listening as the fly on the wall, as it were.
Yeah, you're in there. You're in there.
Yes, with Voegelin at one side. And that influences who I choose because, of course, I'm thinking about who he might want to talk with, but I also have my own sort of interest in hearing thinkers who have profound differences have a rational conversation about those differences. And Voegelin, for example, was very hard on Marx. And Marx has been such a highly influential thinker. I'd love to have Marx in the room because I'd like to see those two go at it, Voegelin and Marx. But I also would choose Aristotle for selfish reasons, in part because he's one of my favorite philosophers and someone that Voegelin wrote about extensively. So he would be an interesting part of the conversation as well, and someone who would give us the perspective of the ancient world. And then maybe someone in the medieval period like St. Augustine, who would also provide a different perspective, and someone that Voegelin relies on to some degree. So Aristotle, Marx, Augustine, with Voegelin in the room and me listening. That's a great day.
It's a long day as well. I mean, that's a big span. That's
Yes.
span almost the entirety of Western philosophy in a certain sense of huge figures from an era, certain eras there. Do you think that immediately there would be a direction this conversation would gravitate towards?
It's hard to know because I think you have to know a lot about the personalities that are in the room. And I don't know what I know about Aristotle's personality or even St. Augustine. Someone has to start the conversation and move it in a particular direction. If I was in the privileged position of being the one who's doing the interviewing of all of these great philosophers, then you can kind of guide and direct them. And I might start with fundamental questions about human nature and the nature of order. Why does conflict exist in political life? What is the basis for order? Why do classes matter? Is property important? Just fundamental questions like that, and then let them run with it.
That's interesting. It's a really expansive room, but I am intrigued because you said that, Voegelin, of course, would influence who you put in the room. If Voegelin wasn't there and you got to pick, I'm intrigued, would there be a completely different room for yourself if it was just three thinkers?
Well, Aristotle stays because he's sort of my favorite. I have somewhat of a preference for statesman scholars, thinkers who also were in the realm of politics. So someone like Cicero is very attractive to me. Machiavelli is another one of those, and Burke. So, they are three that I would certainly consider. And while Aristotle was an advisor to statesmen, he wasn't a statesman himself. But Cicero and Machiavelli and Burke, I think, bring the perspective of someone who practiced politics and also thought about it and wrote about it. And so they had insights that were different than people who were more strictly philosophers.
Okay. Do you think that same thing sort of applies for Voegelin? That he has perhaps the characteristics of a statesman in some of his works?
Well, in the sense that his work is highly colored by the circumstances of his life, by his autobiography. So there he is as a young scholar. He's born in Germany, but as a young child, 8 or 9 years old, he moves to Austria, where he's educated. And after going to the US for a little while, like on a postdoc, and learning some things about the American and continental tradition of political thinking, which he wasn't familiar with, having studied, mainly German political thinking. He starts to write, to teach, and to write about the time as the Anschluss takes place. And he's investigated. One of his early books is on race. It's called Race and State. And, Voegelin is one of the first thinkers, powerful philosophical thinkers, to figure out what's going on with Nazism and why it's a bad thing. And he's writing about it at a very deep philosophical level and coming up with the idea that this has the flavor of something like a political religion. And that's a category that he develops and that he's using, that he doesn't stick with forever, but the main idea stays in his work. And he's investigated by the Gestapo, and they stop publication on one of his books, and they start looking at his other scholarship. And he knows it's only a matter of time before someone who's intelligent enough can figure out what he's saying in the books, and that he's an enemy to the Nazis, an important intellectual enemy to the Nazis. And he's smart enough to figure out he better get out of Austria as quickly as he can. So he sneaks out with the help of friends to Switzerland, and then makes his way to the US, where he spent the better part of his career. But not only that personal experience, but the experience of the rise of totalitarianism in the middle of the 20th century has a profound influence on Voegelin, because it leads him to begin to search for the causes of this disorder in the West. What is going on with 2 world wars and a Holocaust and these great totalitarian movements, one communism replacing another, Nazism? The West has in one sense gone mad, and he wants to get to the bottom of it. And as he investigates the problem as a historical thinker, even though he's a political scientist, he's very historical. He just keeps going back and back to try and discover the origins of political and social order. And the more societies he can study, the better. And the more societies that have had an influence on the sort of evolution of civilization in the West, the better. But that leads him to study non-Western societies as well. And without that personal experience, and without the context that he's facing in his lifetime, he's born at the very beginning of the 20th century, and he lives into the sort of 1984. So most of the 20th century, that's his lifespan. That's an interesting time to be living, to experience all of what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's just it's constant change and constant upheaval. You mentioned a political religion. What's the difference for Voegelin between a political religion and, say, a political party?
Well, a political party is an institutional organization that is organized for action in politics. And while it has a set of ideas that are part of its reason for being, that help to unify the people who are part of it, it doesn't necessarily have to be a political religion. What makes a political religion that, and not something like a political party, is the fact that it mimics some of the main characteristics of traditional religion, of regular religion, and especially in Voegelin's view of Christianity. And why? First and foremost, because it promises salvation from evil and what Voegelin calls metaxic life, using the Greek word in between, right, as the permanent structure of human existence. So it's very important to understand Voegelin's political theory to know that he thought that human beings lived in this human condition that was permanent here in historical life, that humans were imperfect and imperfectible. That society, political society in particular, imperfect and imperfectible. And the only escape from that imperfection, which means the presence of evil, will always exist in politics, and something that politics will have to contend with. The only escape is in death, is leaving history. And what Christianity did was put into the minds of individuals that there is salvation from the suffering, the anxiety, the injustice of this world, but it's outside of history. What political religions do is they bring that eschaton, they bring that end, which Christianity saw as something outside of history, and they pulled it into history. You probably know Voegelin's famous line about immanentizing the eschaton, right? This is it. This is what he's talking about with political religions. They believe that it's possible to immanentize the eschaton. They believe that it's possible to bring a permanent end, that there is a permanent solution to the problem of evil. So if there's one great juxtaposition in Voegelin's work, it's that one, because Voegelin rests his work on the ground that he borrows from Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Greek thinkers, Christian thinkers, that this problem of evil is a permanent problem in politics. And anyone who tries to suggest that it's not a permanent problem, that perfectibility in history is possible, is engaging in a pseudo kind of religion, a Gnosticism, if you will, that leads to the horrors that he witnessed in the 20th century of totalitarianism, because totalitarian movements are political religions that try and immanentize the eschaton. And Marx is one of the great intellectual theorists who make that possible, because he does it in his work, according to Voegelin. And he is a Gnostic because he claims the word Gnostic has its root in the word gnosis, which means secret knowledge, that he has that secret knowledge. He has discovered it, and he knows the solution that unlocks the problem to evil and provides the permanent solution to it. So political religions fit that description of immanentizing the eschaton, and they believe it can be done through political action by operationalizing the secret knowledge that the thinker has gained, and it ends history.
There's a lot there. I mean, it's been said by certain authors that, for instance, you take Marxism or primitivism; these mirror the Christian idea of the world. That they all have their own form of the original sin. They all have their own idea of the fall. Be it in Marxism, the original sin that the means of production went off to the capitalists and they're taken away from the workers, or in primitivists, they say, oh, the original sin is basically that we became agricultural and we should have stayed in this primitive state, etc. But I was talking about this with someone the other day, and this absurdity arises with these movements such as Marxism, that if you are to take the this in the idea of a political religion, if we look at, say, the Tower of Babel, there's an absurdity, almost a paradox, because Marx said atheism is a gateway to Marxism, right? So you need to be secular to be a Marxist. So there's this absurd question of, well, where's the Tower of Babel going for a Marxist? Because there's no God. So you're building a religious structure on top of an absurd, almost Nietzschean dead God, right? So there's this immediate, well, I don't understand where you can go to, because you've already implicitly denied that structure of truth, and you're entering into moral relativism. So would this be for Voegelin almost and actually Augustine is the person who writes of this first, that the retreat to God, the retreat to transcendence, is the answer there all along. You can't just keep going forward. It's that retreat.
Yeah, I mean, and Voegelin would agree with that, and that's partly why his work is an effort to recover experiences, what he calls engendering experiences of order. So in all of the civilizations that he studies, he discovers that human beings are on a quest of sorts to discover the source of order. Even in early cosmological societies that haven't differentiated, that's Voegelinian language that really means to understand something more thoroughly, right? A breakthrough in the structure of reality, how human existence works. In cosmological societies, Voegelin notices that individuals identify in the cosmos, right? Thus the name cosmological. In the cosmos, the evidence of order, the change from night into day and back into day, the change of the seasons and the tides and the moon and eclipse and all sorts of things like that, are evidence that there is order in the physical universe. And those early civilizations create religions and self-understanding around them and connect the order in their lives, in their communities, to this outer order in the cosmos. So that they attune, they talk about attuning themselves to that order. And they don't quite understand what the source of that order is. They think it's the cosmos itself. But then Plato, a very important thinker for understanding Voegelin, makes a great breakthrough, a differentiation. And that is that Plato understands that the source of order in the cosmos is not in the cosmos. It's not the cosmos itself. It's something beyond the cosmos. And Plato gives it the name the beyond, right? And this is the beginning of an understanding of a divine reality, a transcendent reality, something that transcends the cosmos itself, right? Like a creator God. And that has fundamental repercussions for the way human beings begin to understand their connection to this transcendent order and the source of that order. And as Voegelin looks at different societies, then the ancient Israelites and the Greeks and the Egyptians and others, he sees that each of them have a way of understanding what is essentially the same reality. And that is that there is this transcendent source of order that has an effect on the order in the individual soul and the order in political and social life. And Plato is the guy, again, very important for Voegelin, who has this anthropological principle, the parallel between the order in the soul and the order in society, which is itself dependent on attunement to this divine order. And in a way, that's really the foundation for Voegelin's thinking is very much like Plato there, that if you have societies that are not just, great injustices like those that he's experiencing in the 20th century, it's because human beings have lost their understanding and contact with the divine source of order, or they know that it's there and they refuse to attune themselves to it, to attune their individual souls and to attune their societies to it.
Mm-hmm. For Voegelin, could that hierarchical order of the cosmos, as you speak of it, could that in any way become, almost the physical ordering? I mentioned in the questions sort of Joseph de Maistre, the reactionary Catholic, that was his approach to society. You have God who speaks, who's in connection with the Pope, who's then the ruler over the whole lands, and then that goes through to the citizens. So you have this hierarchy where everything is done in order to God. It seems at first glance that Voegelin really isn't talking of this kind of religious or cosmological ordering.
No. Yeah, I mean, Voegelin is not a monarchist. You have to remember about Voegelin, he rejected ideology, period. Mm-hmm. So there's no one way of structuring a political society that Voegelin thinks is right for everywhere, like, say, Francis Fukuyama and others would believe that liberal democracy is what we've discovered to be the final achievement of the human race, and it needs to be implemented everywhere in the world. Voegelin thinks that's a great mistake. That itself leads to a kind of imperialism, because there are certain conditions that are necessary to make liberal political institutions work, and not all societies have those prerequisites for it. And the attempt to force those societies to develop liberal political institutions isn't really all that different than what Marxism tried to do by forcing Marxist political institutions on societies. It leads to a kind of imperialism, democratic imperialism. So Voegelin was opposed to doing anything like that, saying in an ideological way, there's only one right form of government. What societies need to do to kind of figure out the best way to govern themselves is to look at their own heritage, their own experiences, and use that in part as the foundation, as well as these philosophical insights about order, and find their way on their own, wherever that leads them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would suggest, just from my own point of view, that's an extremely controversial idea these days, especially from the Western point of view. I would say that we've come to form this sort of self-justification around the globalization of sort of neoliberalism, placing it everywhere. I mean, what are the sort of the contexts for differing forms of ideology or governance for Voegelin in different cultures and different places of the world? Why is it that he said certain places perhaps just wouldn't be able to be liberal?
It's a fascinating question and a complex one, and I'm going to speak for myself first, and then I'm going to come back to Voegelin. because I think this is one of those instances where a concrete historical example or two goes a long way.
Mm-hmm.
So the question about whether or not Voegelin's political theory somehow leads to a form of absolutism in politics, in my view, puts the whole thing upside down. And why is it upside down? Because it's those people who believe that liberal democracy is the paramount, if not the exclusive form of government, that are the absolutists and the imperialists. Think about it. They're saying there's only one right way to do this. And what does it lead to in the actual conduct of politics? Is there a better time than now to reflect on the American intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan and say, this is what it leads to? It leads to disastrous wars where you try and impose liberal democratic institutions on societies that obviously, it should be to us now, are not prepared to make them work. Well, what conditions would someone like Voegelin say have to be present for those institutions to work? Well, how about the rule of law? That's certainly one with all that it implies. And it's obvious that a place like Afghanistan is incapable of functioning within the rule of law, right? Mm-hmm. They function within the rule of mere raw power. Mm-hmm. And that's something very different than the rule of law. And if you naively believe, as American leaders have, going back to George W. Bush, that you can somehow create the rule of law in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq, because as Bush said, we know that all human beings are freedom loving. They love rights. They love what we love. They love the rule of law. No, they don't. I don't know what could be more obvious than that. And I don't know how people live through the 20th century or study it with the rise of totalitarian and authoritarian movements and somehow naively believe in a Pollyanna idealist sort of way that you can take liberal political institutions through force and the use of the military in an imperialistic way and impose it on societies. How many of these failed attempts do we have to see before we realize that the question you asked is turned on its head? The question we should be asking is, why do so many people who advocate liberal democracy believe that it is the only correct form of government and should be imposed on people who don't want it?
Mm-hmm. Why do you believe that liberals do believe that, or do you think that's just a symptom of basically the majority of ideologies is that if you are a firm believer, you do believe that it would be the best thing for everyone?
Well, I don't think all liberals believe it, first of all. I think there's a difference between different kinds of liberals. And liberals who we might call libertarian are far less apt to believe that you should impose liberal democracy on other countries than, say, progressive liberals or neoconservatives who are really liberals, a different kind of liberal. And why are they prone to believe it? They're prone to believe it because they're progressives. Because in one sense, at least to some degree, they are what Voegelin would call Gnostics. They believe they have secret knowledge. What is the secret knowledge? That we have discovered for all time what the best form of government is. We know how to eradicate evil permanently. So George W. Bush is a great example of this because he believes, I believe in his heart of hearts, that he believed in the aftermath of 9/11 at least, that the cause of conflict and turmoil in places like the Middle East, which create the environment in which terrorism is born, is non-democratic nation states. The problem is really a matter of regime type. It's not, like Voegelin would say, a problem of the soul. It's a problem of the way society is organized. And this is the way Gnostics tend to think, according to Voegelin. And Bush believes, and many of his advisors believed, that they had to figure out how to reorganize the world in order to make it less violent, if not bring an end to war and conflict. Well, how do you do that? You turn non-democratic regimes into democratic regimes, because democratic regimes, the assumption is, the ideology, really the Gnosticism, is that democratic regimes are not belligerent. They're peaceful. So if all you have are democratic regimes, then it becomes like the relationship between the US and Canada, right? It's unthinkable that there could be some sort of war between them.
Mm-hmm. But the irony, of course, and perhaps Voegelin would agree with this, that it seems that it's very easy to say that democratic regimes are peaceful in relation to sort of the great theatre of history, where you have wars and this sort of very external, obvious violence. But the violence of democratic regimes, which are predominantly secular, seems to be turned inwards, where you have these higher divorce rates, higher crime rates, higher drug use, etc. And the violence is basically turned on its head. But because we don't have this sort of, because there isn't this like clear war, everything seems better, and it's much easier to self-justify that there isn't a violence, but actually the violence is sort of in a way immanentized, and you just end up basically the violence is of the individual onto themselves. So this once again seems to be the Voegelin point, that once you're separated from transcendence, disarray just begins to unfold.
Yes. And to sort of restate the point that you made, it is somewhat ironic that people who believe that you can export liberal democracy to countries that aren't prepared for it don't understand that liberal democracy is falling apart in places like the United States. If you can't make it work here, how can you make it work in those other places? So let me just give you one of the important foundations for liberal democratic institutions that's part of the rule of law, or at least connected to the rule of law, is a willingness on the part of people, broadly speaking, including representatives, to accept the legitimacy of their political rivals' claims, to the point that they are willing to compromise with them, to reach a consensus with them, to not be so highly polarized, to believe that the other side only represents evil things and your side only represents good things. You have to have that cultural and existential foundation. You have to have certain trust in political institutions, in the way that you choose your rulers, in the way that laws and policies are made. Well, that's all breaking down in the US and in some respects in the Western world generally. And we should never forget that constitutional democracy is probably the most difficult form of government to conduct, because it requires so many more people than, say, monarchy or aristocracy to participate in the system and to believe in what I just described, including the rule of law and the importance of compromise and consensus. And when you lose in the leadership class and you lose in society more generally, the willingness to do those things, then constitutional democracy breaks down. And if you don't have those things to begin with, as we learned from Afghanistan and Iraq, then you really can't make liberal political institutions work. You have to have those prerequisites. And just because you have them at one time doesn't mean that you can maintain them over time. And Voegelin was well aware that these were political institutions that required certain spiritual nourishment, because it was the order in the soul ultimately that was reflected in the political and social order. And so if you lose contact with that divine reality, if it's not the thing that is ordering your souls, which happens in part when people become more secular, and when genuine spirituality is replaced with political religion, things like that, that's when things start to break loose. And that's one of Voegelin's great insights and contribution to the field of political science.
Just before we sort of, there's a question there that I'd like to ask about teleology, but just before we do so, I'm sort of, it's very refreshing to speak to someone who at least sees this and doesn't consider themselves, I'm going to perhaps assume, doesn't consider themselves one of these liberals that just assumes that everything that they believe is correct. And, you know, I think this began around 2014, around the Brexit vote for me, and realizing that this is all starting to accelerate. But the idea, as you said, that that one side didn't see the other side's opinion as just or perhaps rational. They just basically outright said, well, they're just wrong, right? And this happened with Brexit, even though democracy had won because everyone had their vote. one side basically said, well, all right, well, you might have voted this in, but it's still obviously wrong. And that was probably when I think the cracks began to show for liberal democracy in the UK, because it was clear that the overwhelming sort of consensus, which was out in the open, was against what had been voted in. So there was a huge sort of just a paradox of decision that and a real impasse of what to really do from that moment on, because nothing had been taken on real. Democracy hadn't really been agreed.
Right. Well,
and the same thing with Trump, I would say as well.
Right. The common thread that you see in England and the US both in these cases, I think, is that a failure on the part of many political elites to realize what was obvious to many working class people, and that is globalism isn't good for everyone. And because they failed to realize that, they created a backlash. And the backlash came in the form of Trump and Brexit and in other European countries as well. And even after all of that is done, there still seems to be an unwillingness on the part of both sides to say, there's something legitimate about what the other side is saying. It becomes an all or nothing proposition, which is not the right foundation for constitutional liberal democracies. Right? You've got to accept the legitimacy. In rare cases, you don't, of course, say with totalitarian movements, but with, basically mainstream political movements, you have to say, well, I disagree, but I understand they have a different interest. James Madison's Federalist Paper number 10 is a wonderful place to look for the very spirit of liberal democratic institutions, because it acknowledges that there are competing interests, and that the role of representatives is to refine and enlarge the public views, to bring together competing interests and views, and to synthesize them. We are losing the ability to synthesize seemingly disparate political ideas and interests. That's the heart and soul of constitutional politics and constitutional government, but you wouldn't know it from the way we conduct it and the way we talk about it now.
So it seems from that once the eschaton is immanentized into these forms, that really the only place we gravitate towards is evil. Evil in the sense of no one any longer has the capability to, should we say, consider externally, to consider the other's opinion. I mean, that's sort of one very loose definition of evil would be just to consider yourself, be the complete atomized individual, and they only care about themselves.
Yes. But let me clarify a point for listeners who may misunderstand what Voegelin is saying here. Mm-hmm. His point is you can't immanentize the eschaton. It's not possible to do it. The attempt to try and do it is what leads to such great evil. How? What would an example of that be? Well, if you think about 20th century American presidents, select number of them, and their attempt to, in essence, immanentize the eschaton, starting with Woodrow Wilson. How does he try and do that? By eradicating war permanently, by believing that a war can be fought to end all wars, a war that he admits in his war message to Congress, there is no American interest in getting involved in this war. There's no security interest for the United States. We just, like good humanitarians, want to make the world a better place. We want to free the world of war. That's right, why the UN exists, right? To eliminate the scourge of war. And what happens, ironically, in the aftermath of that is arguably the bloodiest, most brutal century in human history, where war, as it almost always is a permanent part of human existence. And you exacerbate the problem of war. These examples that we've been discussing about Iraq and Afghanistan are the consequence of believing that you can permanently eradicate evil. And again, it's ironic that the world becomes more violent when you believe that you can permanently cure it of violence. Franklin Roosevelt does something similar in believing that we can rid ourselves of the anxiety over economic depression and recession. LBJ thinks we can permanently eradicate poverty. George H.W. Bush thinks we can permanently eradicate illicit drug use. Think about that. Just a few years before the opioid crisis hits in the US, which has been astronomical. It's killed far more people than COVID has killed. And why? And here's a guy who believes that with public policy, we can eliminate a problem like illegal drug use. And he declares victory as we're on the verge of probably the greatest drug crisis that America has ever faced. And then his son, George W. Bush, believes that you can eradicate terrorism from the world by fighting wars and changing regimes from non-democratic to democratic. This is not what Madison is talking about. When Madison brings up the problem of factions in Federalist 10, he says they can't be eradicated. Why? Because their causes are sewn into human nature itself. And because you can't change human nature, you're going to have to learn to live with these problems. So if you have to learn to live with them, the best we can do is control the effects of factions. We can't permanently eliminate them. And so he talks about representation and expanding the orbit of government as reasonable, prudential solutions that will minimize the problem of factions by actually multiplying them to weaken them. But there's no permanent solution there in Federalist 10. Madison is a good anti-Gnostic, whether he knows it or not, when he's writing Federalist 10.
Okay, there's something interesting there that Voegelin sort of is always targeting towards order in relation to the divine. So why is it, even though these Gnostic movements, liberal democracy, Marxism, etc., even though their ultimate aim is to head towards some form of societal order, how come that always fails?
Because they're attempting to accomplish the unaccomplishable, the impossible dream, right? The dream that can't come true. It goes back to Voegelin's point about the very structure of reality, the imperfection of human beings and the imperfectibility of human beings in human society. So trying to perfect something that can't be perfected, trying in essence to change human nature when it can't be changed, is why they fail. And why that even though it sounds nice to do things like end war, I mean, think of the French Revolution as one of the great mass revolutionary movements in modernity, right? Liberty, equality, and fraternity. Who's not in favor of those things? Well, I'm not in favor of them if they're thought of in a way that leads to the horrors and the bloodshed of the French Revolution. So often what sounds good, boy, wouldn't it be nice to live in a world that didn't have war, that didn't have poverty, that didn't have these things that are permanent parts of human existence. Voegelin is in a way urging us to learn to spiritually cope with the permanence of evil. Mm-hmm. And the problem with Gnostics, he says, is they suffer from what he calls pneumopathology. Fancy word for spiritual sickness, meaning that they cannot cope with the permanence of evil. So Gnosticism begins with something that probably most of us share, and that is a deep disappointment with the world as it is. But what Gnostics do is they take that and it leads to their efforts to try and undo the very structure of existence. Right? Mm-hmm. Instead of coping with it, they want to escape from it. And escaping from it means that you can make these changes to the ground of being, as Voegelin would call it, human nature, the structure of existence, the metaxy. They're all words that Voegelin uses to signify that this human condition is a permanent thing. And so if there's a great divide here, I would say it would be Voegelin and his philosophical and intellectual allies dating back at least to Plato, who would say, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, human beings are fallen and you have to live with the consequences of that. And those who say, no, human beings either aren't fallen, like Rousseau would say, we start out as being naturally good, and then we organize society in a way by creating private property or some sort of convention or institution. And that's what messes things up. So we can fix that. and go back to things, go back to our natural goodness, or we can evolve in a direction where human nature becomes increasingly better morally and eventually perfected. And Marx is one of the great offenders, according to Voegelin, in believing that we can make that great transformation. But look at what Marxism has done.
Well, some would say it's never been tried. But Voegelin's not defeatist. He doesn't just want people to sort of lay down. It's not an apathetic acceptance of, well, there's evil, so don't worry about it. People are going to die. So I guess in some sense, there is the practice of the Marxists or the practice of say the libertarians. They have things that they believe will change things towards some sort of order, some sort of good. Does Voegelin have such things which are, of course, in keeping with the idea that, yeah, there will always be evil, but here's some way we can order society to at least dampen the evil of the world?
Right. So first, keep in mind that Voegelin devoted his professional life to understanding and undermining totalitarianism and other political movements that lead to injustice and disorder. So he himself is the last person who could ever be criticized for, sitting back and saying, well, we just have to accept evil. And in fact, he says explicitly that we not only don't have to accept the disorder of our age, but we're obligated to push back against it. Knowing that we cannot permanently eradicate evil is not an excuse for not doing what can be done to make life more just. And here, I think, is a very important point that creates a contrast to the way many people think about problems of injustice today. Voegelin, following the Greeks, would say that the starting point for pushing back against injustice is in your own soul. It is in reforming your own character. So Voegelin is the furthest thing from a social justice guy, right? The problem in part with many people who promote social justice is they distract our attention from the primary source of justice and injustice, which is the human soul. It's us. We are the problem. We are the ones who are fallen, right? It's why Christians on Good Friday remind themselves that they're responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. They need to get their own house in order first and foremost before they go out into the world and try and reform it. So the starting point is very different. Many people who advocate social justice leave out of the equation the importance of virtue and existential order. T.S. Eliot crystallizes the point in his poem Choruses from the Rock when he says of these Gnostic sort of reformers, they dream of systems, something like so good. They dream of systems that no one will need to be good. Once we create them and we implement them, we won't need virtue anymore. And if you've ever read Edward Bellamy's novel, Looking Backward, that is exactly what Bellamy says. He says the 10 Commandments become unnecessary and extinct because no one is even tempted to do evil anymore. And that's a very different way of thinking. The social justice way of focusing on the way society is organized and believing if you reorganize it, you can eliminate great injustices. And Voegelin's way of thinking about it, which is the root cause of injustice is in the human soul. It's an inability to order one's soul and abide by virtue, to attune oneself to the transcendent order.
Well, I guess this is one of the something I wanted to bring in. It's one of the major problems of, I guess, the difference between a Christian teleology and a secular teleology is that, there's this idea, and it always makes me laugh when I discuss this with some other guests, the idea of a progressive. Well, okay, where are we progressing to? What's this magical place which no one has ever defined? And this is one of the immediate problems of virtue that I think we see today. The deep irony. You were speaking about that the individual soul is where one can begin to battle evil. A deep irony of, I'm speaking of predominantly secular Western liberal democracies, is that they herald themselves as sort of the bastions of individuality, right? It's the cult of the individual. Each individual is God. We all sort of have our own little lives, and we no longer really have major senses of community and family. And yet at the same time, we don't really take any individual responsibility, and our virtue is mostly this signaling to say like, oh, I have done this good thing, but we haven't really changed anything in ourselves, because the virtue just seems to continuously change. We need some new thing to align with good, and it just keeps changing, and nothing ever really changes, and it becomes more sort of, you can never really grasp it because there is no real end. There's no real structure to get to. Whereas in, of course, in the Christian tradition, it is to get yourself closer to God, and it is abide to a morally objective structure. So there doesn't seem to be an end, really. You know, Fukuyama, of course, called it the end of history, and we're still living in it. It's still going
right.
on.
And even he has had to back off from that, in part because of the historical realities of the failure of liberal democracies. Right. So reality eventually beats these people over the head. And that's part of Voegelin's point, and why it's a never ending project of progressives to fix the world, because the world's never going to be fixed. And it's a fundamental difference, I think, in regard to the meaning and purpose of human existence itself. Is as you become more secular, you believe it's all about life in this world. So you better fix it because this is the best and the only thing that there is. And for somebody who has, the belief that there's a transcendent source of order and that human beings live beyond history, has a different perspective. So, Augustine is the guy who talks about us passing through this world as pilgrims to our ultimate destiny. It changes the purpose and meaning of life here if there is an afterlife that is our ultimate destination, which goes back to Voegelin's point about immanentizing the eschaton. Mm-hmm. Right? If it's all about this world, if you bring the end, the ultimate end of human existence into history, then you behave in a very different way. You think in a very different way than if you believe that that eschaton is outside of history. And Voegelin, I think, does a wonderful job of giving us lots of examples of these political religions and ideological movements who do that very thing, who fit this pattern of trying to bring the eschaton into history and what the disastrous results are. And in the end, that's his answer to why 20th century order broke down in the Western world.
Did he believe that sort of a retreat, a return would be possible, even in societies such as our own, which are absolutely steeped in, the eschaton has been fully immanentized? Did he believe that a reversion to a divine way of life would be possible en masse?
He was hopeful. He was more hopeful than I would say I am. Of course, I've lived a few decades beyond Voegelin. But he thought that the intellectual work that was being done and learning from the experiences of the great totalitarian movements would kind of combine to knock sense into people and to do what he was suggesting that they do. And that is to immerse themselves in these experiences of order from the past, from history, as a way of orienting oneself to that divine transcendent order. Make it a living force. Not that for Voegelin, it's not a matter of imitation, right? Every era and set of circumstances has its own challenges and idiosyncrasies. So it's not a matter of just thinking like some great thinker in the past or creating laws like those that were created in the past. It's not that at all. It's learning how to learning what transcendence is, learning how to attune oneself to that divine source of order, which itself leads to the kind of solutions that are needed in your circumstances in your time. So it's making those things from the past a living force in the present. But Voegelin is no believer in traditionalism, if by that is meant that we figured it out in the past and we just need to make it work in the present. No, you have to kind of reconstitute from the past in the future in your own circumstances.
You say you're not as optimistic. Do you mind if I ask, what do you see the sort of political future in relation to the divine? What does that look like for you in the West?
Well, I think since Voegelin's death, if we first use the example of sort of the health of constitutional democracy in the West, and here in my own country, in the United States, it has degenerated significantly from the time of Voegelin's death. And we have really lost sight of what it is and what makes it work and what its spiritual foundations are. And you see it in different facets of life. So it's common that American children, for example, go through grade school and middle school and high school and even college now, and they never even study anything about American political institutions, the origins of American political institutions, the historical development of American political institutions. And what they do when they do study it is really this dry textbook approach that has become laced with ideology itself. Identity politics is the big ideology now. It takes a great deal of courage to even say we shouldn't do that. That's not the way we should do these things, because it's becoming the dominant ideology. And that way of thinking, which is there's only one right way to think about these things, is beginning to take hold. I think in Voegelin's day, there were still some healthy debates and arguments, and we were close to the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War. We were kind of coming out of the end of the horrors of the 20th century and seemed to have learned some lessons from it. And as time has gone on, I think we've forgotten a lot of that experience. Number one. And number two, even the study of the sort of things that Voegelin wrote about has been in decline. Voegelin has followers and people write, but I'm talking about in the academy. There's not a lot of interest, widespread interest in the sort of things that Voegelin was writing about.
You think that the majority of sort of political study in the academy is itself unknowing, ignorantly steeped in this liberal democratic secularism which we've spoken about?
Or some other form of ideology.
That's tough to escape, though.
That's right. Very tough to escape.
Yeah.
So you do what you can. You have to find a way to at least reach the students that come into your classes and classrooms to read things that help them at least understand that there's an alternative way to thinking about problems of order. And sometimes it takes and sometimes it doesn't. But one of the frustrations in teaching someone like Voegelin is what I explained at the beginning of our conversation, and that is he's not an easy thinker to read and say, oh, this is wonderful. I want to read more. I want to learn more. And they become, part of understanding the problems of order in the way that Voegelin did. That's rare.
Do you believe he has been overlooked for this very reason?
Yes. I think you have to be reasonable about the extent to which any significant philosophical thinker dealing with complex problems like Voegelin was is going to have an effect, that the ideas are going to filter down into a particular culture or civilization. It's a pretty elite thing that most intellectuals do, whether it's Voegelin or it's Hegel or whoever it is. But Marxism is a good example of how, fairly dense philosophical way of thinking filtered down into lots of different aspects of life. And people, whether they realize it or not now, identity politics is itself a derivative of Marxism. So whether you know it or not, you're sort of following the ideas of Marx. Well, how does that happen? It happens in part because the thinker, for good or ill, came up with ideas that were ripe. Right? People they sort of wanted to hear something like that. So if you take Marx, why are his ideas so influential? Why were they early on and later on? Partly because of the problems created by industrialization. Right? Workers were treated pretty horribly. Doesn't mean that Marx was right about his ideology and immanentizing the Eschaton, but he put his finger on something that was a problem that was perhaps not sufficiently being addressed. And he provided a pretty simple explanation for why it exists, which was easy for people to latch onto. And he provided a permanent solution to the problem, which is tempting to many people. A guy like Voegelin faces the problem that when you're saying there are no permanent solutions, where's the great hope? Marx provides tremendous hope. It's a false hope, but tremendous hope in the ability to transform human existence and create this heaven on earth. Voegelin is the guy who's saying, you're never going to have a heaven on earth. You're going to live in metaxic life, and it's going to be hard. Here are ways to cope with it and maintain your dignity and live a good life and achieve happiness, a sort of lasting sense of satisfaction that comes from living a good life.
Well, that's one thing I would say there is, it probably wouldn't surprise you, but I'm not left wing. But with Marx, I would say that his sort of critique and his criticisms of capitalism are great, but then as soon as he comes in with the answer of how to then solve these criticisms, these problems, that's when you would say in the Voegelin sense, that's when the Eschaton's starting to be immanentized. Whereas you could say we've got all these criticisms, but we can work with them within a divine scheme of things. Maybe.
Right, but that means limits to the solution. And Marx, according to Voegelin, is too existentially distraught with the injustices to accept the idea that there's a permanence to the larger injustice, and that reform is the only thing that's really possible that allows you to make things better but not perfect. It's that quest for perfection which really separates the reformer from the revolutionary, the Gnostic revolutionary who believes in the permanent solution.
Okay. Where would you advise people to begin with Voegelin? As you've said, he's quite tough to begin with. I mean, of course, there's your own book for the Library of Modern Thinkers, simply called Eric Voegelin.
Yeah, but for what it's worth, my book was written to serve this very purpose as an introduction to Voegelin's work. So if you're talking about a secondary source, my book on Voegelin is not a bad place to start. But if you're talking about a primary source reading in Voegelin himself, there are a couple of places that you can begin. One is The New Science of Politics, which is a relatively thin volume. Science, Politics, and Gnosticism may even be a better place to start. That's a short little monograph on the problem of Gnosticism, the problem of positivism. And the third place I would suggest is Voegelin's essays. Voegelin's work has been published in several volumes, and there are a few on his published and unpublished essays. And a lot of his essays, which are on more topical things in his day, communication and democracy, the readiness of individuals for rational debate. He's got some great stuff in there, an article that can be read in a couple of hours and can give you a sense for where he's coming from and lead you to his deeper philosophical works.
Is there anything you feel we've missed about Voegelin? Obviously, there's a mass of things that we could add in, but is there anything key that you'd like to add in that you feel we've missed?
There's a lot to Voegelin, but I think we hit the things that are most important for people to understand about his work. And I would encourage people, even though, as was the case in my own experience, it can be a little frustrating beginning to read Voegelin. It's well worth it to push through that frustration, because what you get at the other end is a very insightful analysis of the Western crisis of order that is different than you're going to read with many other thinkers. It's a powerful thing, even if you don't agree with it or all of it. It's well worth considering. It will grow your mind.
Are you currently working on any other books? I know you've written on Alexander Hamilton and a collection of, is it Brownson?
Brownson, yes. I'm always working on something. And I just published an article on Russell Kirk, who tried to write about Voegelin's ideas and make them more accessible to people in a more popular audience. But my book projects, I have two that I'm working on right now. One is my very first book was on populism 30 years ago, and a lot has changed. There's been a lot written on populism. And so I started working on a new manuscript about populism to rethink some of what I wrote in that first book and to take into account new developments and new scholarship in populism. And the other book that I've been working on for a long time that I just can't seem to get back to is one on judicial power and judicial politics in the US.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty heavy stuff. Do you when's the book on populism? Do you know when that will be ready?
It's going to take a sabbatical to get it done. So if any of my deans and my provost are listening, I'm a department chair, so I have to stop being department chair to make great progress on any manuscript. And I have this year and next left in my term, and then I'm done. Wow. And that is hopefully when I might be able to get a sabbatical and finish one of my books.
Well, when they're out, contact me and I'd love to talk about them.
Oh, I enjoyed our conversation thoroughly. You did a wonderful job of asking the questions. I didn't even know I was being interviewed.
Thanks very much.